I want to just kind of ask you to introduce yourself and your organization.
Thanks, Jess. So my job here at the California Partnership in Domestic Violence is to serve as the executive director. And the partnership is the statewide domestic violence coalition representing 1,000 advocates, organizations, allied partners, all really coming together in our coalition to end domestic violence here in California. So we really focus here at the coalition level on three main areas. We strive to advance public policies and social system sort of changes. We advance communications and increase public awareness, and we work to also build capacity for all of those out in the field to be able to prevent and intervene in domestic violence throughout California. So we really see ourselves as a connector. We understand that there's a lot of expertise and wisdom out in the field, and we really help connect advocates out in the field with policymakers in Sacramento and in DC and advancing the cause all across the state of California.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Jacquie Marroquin and I'm the Capacity Building Program Manager with the partnership. Our department essentially does exactly that. We help build the capacity of the field, of folks in the domestic violence field in California. As Kathy says, we know there's a lot of expertise within the field, and we, in our team, we work to rise those voices and to lift up those experiences and that expertise from the field, while at the same time connecting those experts to other experts. So we value the work that is coming out of California, and lots of folks are doing some really cool, interesting things. And so our job is really to find those folks and then let them tell us their stories, and then we elevate those experiences for everybody else in the state. So. Molly's a perfect example.
Absolutely, yeah. My name is Molly Heck, and I'm the Associate Director at Catalyst Domestic Violence Services. We're up in Butte County, California, which is about an hour and a half north of Sacramento. So it was a nice drive this morning. Our agency is typical of many domestic violence agencies across the state in that we provide a host of services to both intervene in domestic violence as well as to help prevent and educate the community. So we have emergency shelter and transitional housing. We provide legal advocacy and drop-in crisis counseling, as well as a variety of other individualized services. We're really proud to be providing specialized services and culturally specific services for people who identify as part of the LGBTQ+ community. And we're really excited to expand our work this year to share our expertise with regional partners in Northern California to help them build their capacity around serving what we consider an underserved population within the movement.
Thank you. Great. So I want to just kind of start at the very beginning, and I want to ask, what are social norms? Because we really want to get to the bottom of what causes domestic violence. So we have to look at what social norms are to do that. So who has kind of a working definition we can go off of what are social norms?
No. Well, I can jump in. I think of social norms, and I talk to a lot of, we do a lot of work with college students as well, and so having this conversation is really important in their world as they're learning about themselves and learning about the world. But social norms really are the expectations that society has about how we behave in the world, and that behavior is dependent on our identity. So as a female, as a white woman, as someone in my 30s, there are all these expectations that society has of me, and those expectations are regulated by formally by laws, but they're also regulated by our community and by each other. So, for example, a very simple sort of example of what a social norm might be is in our dress. So, as I was thinking about this conversation, I have a nephew who is in high school, and one of the social norms about how we dress, whether we're gendered male or gendered female, and now we have certainly folks who identify as transgender in a lot of ways. But if my nephew, who presents as a young man, were to show up in a dress at high school, like that one of his female friends would wear, there would be some really negative consequences for him, because that is outside of what we consider a social norm for his gender. So he'd be called names, he'd potentially be laughed at, some people would potentially support him and think that that was okay to express yourself in that way. But in general, social norms, what I feel like is really important to remember are these consequences for stepping outside of them.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. And I think that social norms are sort of the unspoken rules as to what is allowed and what is not allowed. Can anyone kind of expand upon what those, kind of who creates the rules, and...
I would say that some of those, not some, but many of those social norms are often invisible to us. Yeah. It's not necessarily something that we wake up in the morning and we decide what to put on our bodies for the day, and we're not thinking that this is a social norm. That it's something that we learn throughout time, and as Molly was saying, it's something that we learn from folks around us, right? Our families, our communities, what we watch on television, what becomes normal and acceptable for everyone to do, and falling outside of that is where folks will often experience some of those negative consequences.
That's when you become aware of, you hit up against a social norm that's widely accepted.
Right.
And you step out of it.
And when you fully step into those social norms, those socially accepted norms, then there is also a social reward.
Right.
For stepping into those.
Right.
For conforming to those social norms. So it could be something, whether it's in a school or even within your own family. There are some very important social norms in many families, and stepping into those actually has a reward attached to it.
Very good point. So now let's go into domestic violence. What is domestic violence?
So many things.
Yes, so many things.
Yes.
I mean, I think that as we understand it in the field, and what we've heard from many victims and survivors, is that domestic violence, as it's perpetrated, is a pattern of behaviors in which someone exerts power and control over their intimate partner. And hopefully we have dispelled the myth that it's only physical violence. I think that that's certainly still present, that's maybe the first thing that people think of because it's really scary. But verbal abuse and psychological abuse and financial abuse are also really scary. So, this notion that there's not equality in a partnership, I think, is sort of at the heart of domestic violence, and certainly, it runs the spectrum of really extreme, really lethal kinds of violence, to things that we might consider on the unhealthy side of the spectrum of disrespect and name calling and those kinds of things that not allowing someone to have voice or decision making in a partnership.
Okay, thank you. So we see it as a deliberate and escalating pattern of maintaining power and control over someone. And when we look at the social norms that contribute to domestic violence, kind of putting those two things that we were just discussing together, what do you see as social norms that are at the root cause of domestic violence? I mean, there are so many. You start anywhere.
I mean, I'll just start. We can throw out several. I think, the sense that the way to get what you want in a relationship is to abuse or control the other one, the other partner. That really does contribute, and that's a norm that kind of underlies what's going on in relationships where there's abuse happening.
Yeah, that's an acceptable kind of behavior. And it's one of those examples where we can see there's formal law that allows that to be acceptable, and then there's our interactions with our families and our friends that
we look the other way and we
when we don't say anything.
Condone.
But then there are actual, and they're still on the books, up until 2 decades ago maybe, that you could sexually assault your wife, and that was an appropriate way to control your partner in a relationship. And that those are still lingering, those kinds of ideas.
Right.
It's a lack of one person being able to have control and power over their bodies, also over their other relationships, right? It's also, you know, if someone is unable to have a friendship outside of their partners because that partner might have a negative reaction, there is a social norm there about who you, once you are in a relationship with a partner, whether or not it is acceptable for you to be able to have friendships with other people, and how that often gets regulated at many different levels of the relationship, from very, very early on to, you know, as the relationship also progresses. And so that's also another way. The social norm would be for somebody to have control and power over all of your relationships and gets to decide whether or not you get to have these other relationships or not.
I think we also just have norms in our country around relationships are inherently private and personal, intimate relationships, whether it's dating or marital or cohabitation or whatever, and that what happens in the home or what happens in the context of that relationship is just between those two parties, and that it's not okay to intervene, it's not okay to ask questions or to, you don't want to meddle around in the affairs of your family or your friends or what have you. And that just continues to kind of create climates where abuse and control happens in isolation and secrecy.
Yeah, I've been thinking of sort of the really basic notions of gender in our sort of U.S. white-centric culture, right? And this notion that what a real man looks like and what a real woman looks like, we're still really stuck, I think, in these places of, you know, what men and masculinity looks like and sounds like is the man of the house, masculine, loves football, is aggressive, is the decision maker in the household, right? And if we're talking about straight relationships, then the woman in the partnership is sort of the balance to that. So she's the nurturer, she's kind, she's gentle, she often, you know, she isn't aggressive, she backs away on big decisions, perhaps, and defers to her husband or her male partner. And just thinking of that dynamic and all of the centuries that has been going on, okay, so then it seems sort of natural that men would exert more control in a relationship and feel normal and entitled to just exert that kind of control because that's sort of what the woman is supposed to do. She's supposed to be quiet, she's supposed to listen to what I do and what I say, and be that sort of nurturing presence and not question me. So if we can see that those really extreme kind of gender roles potentially are still playing out across the country, then, you know, that sort of social learning theory, that social learning notion that's how we understand ourselves from the time we're really small, that's what our role should be in a relationship. So I think those, like I said, sort of stereotypical gender roles are still really playing out in creating inequality and power in relationships.
And I think there are moments in time as people are being socialized around social norms. There are moments in time when there are things that seem contradictory. So, you know, to your example about women being very, feminine and very, very quiet, and so it's sort of that selfless, tireless person who does everything for their family. That we, you know, many of us grew up with that model in our homes, and so. And often, so much of there are also contradicting ideas that are coming to us on a very regular basis, and so we often have to make these choices about, you know, how do I choose to exist in the world, and often our default is what we have also experienced and seen, and what is the model that's closest to us. And, you know, there can be contradictions in that, and there can also be some lessons in that we get to carry through in our own lives. And so, and I think for both, you know, for both of those extremes, you know, there are still moments when we often will see glimpses of those contradictions in those relationships.
yeah, and I think that it's sort of, when we think about the consequences or the contradictions in that, if we think about violence in relationships, then it's often when those contradictions or those conflicts come up, right? Is that, I learned to be this way in a relationship, and so my partner is expecting me to be that way, to be quiet, but I'm not really feeling like that anymore. I'm feeling more empowered. I'm feeling like I want to make my own decision, and so I'm going to. And then there's conflict in the relationship, and I think we certainly see a lot of women, and again, we know that domestic violence affects all genders of people, but we're still seeing 95% female victims coming into our services, and we hear them say that sometimes the violence is occurring because they're trying to make a change in their life, or they're trying to take control, or they're trying to get a job when they've never had one before, and really drawing on a lot of different models now of what a woman can be in the world. Absolutely, yeah.
And what about, so you've talked about the role of rigid gender expectations or roles really being a form of oppression in the way it manifests in abusive relationships. What can you tell me about the way other forms of oppression, how do they contribute to domestic violence?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think that certainly racist oppression has, there are a lot of ways that impacts and intersects in relationships as well. So, for instance, the notion that for Latino women, right, the notion that being the mother and the nurturer is often a big part of family life. There may also be ways in which in the broader sort of white society that woman is not experiencing the sort of empowered mother role in society because she's looked down on because she is a person of color. So the way that might intersect if she were trying to seek services for abuse in her relationship, and she shows up to an agency who doesn't understand her culture, doesn't understand the role of motherhood, doesn't understand the importance of of divorce in a relationship, and that's a very deep cultural and religiously sort of sanctioned bond. Then sort of the white service provider is going to put all those sort of white values onto encouraging her to leave, and really not valuing the potential of change and how her community could help her and all of those kinds of things. So we certainly see that in a lack of Latino women coming forward in those situations because they don't feel like sort of general white society is going to listen to their values in the same way because they've experienced it, I think, in many other terms, not just within domestic violence. So that's what comes to mind. I also think of, as Catalyst, really tries to provide services to the LGBTQ population. There's, lots of homophobia that still exists in the world, and things as simple as, if we go back to gender roles, and sort of there's two female partners, and one is more masculine looking, and she's the larger of the two, but the physically smaller person is the actual abusive partner. Then we may not believe that person, that the physically larger female partner, that she's actually getting abused by someone smaller, because we have these expectations that it's the big masculine-looking person that is the abusive partner. So our notions about sort of straight relationships and that sort of thing get plopped on top of how we understand that relationship.
That's what I was going to talk about. When I think about other forms of oppression and how they relate with domestic violence, there's this layering effect. And if we are drilling down to an individual victim or survivor or relationship, that layering effect has, really serves to kind of reduce options and to create more shame, both for both partners, actually. And options for seeking safety or getting help. And then even just kind of on a larger level, when we're talking about social norms again, when we're operating in kind of communities and in our society where we have different stereotypical or oppressive beliefs or behaviors or laws, it reinforces this notion of communities or relationships, the perceptions of unhealthiness or
yeah.
Right.
Sorry,
Yeah. Yeah.
lost it there, just spun out. But I guess what I'm getting is when various communities are feeling these layers of oppression, the sense of being able to speak out and to say there's something potentially going wrong in my relationship or in our community is rather it's a weightier sort of question about speaking out when you're facing so much extreme divisiveness and oppression and judgment from the mainstream community in general.
The whole, like, airing your dirty laundry. Yeah, like, I'm not sure if I want to go there because we're already struggling with, you know, all these racist and classist and, you know.
Immigrant sentiments.
Yeah, absolutely. So why would I bring more into my community? Yeah.
I think that's what you both are saying, actually, is this layering effect. It's almost like you get one blanket and one sheet and you put it over a person, and that's you know, the issues of domestic violence, and you know, trying to look through one sheet and trying to make your way across a room to whatever it is that you need to do can be difficult. But you add to that the layer of, you know, being an undocumented immigrant in a place where, you know, there's lots of anti-immigrant sentiments, very public anti-immigrant sentiments. You add to that another layer of another sheet, right, where, you know, somebody who doesn't speak English and who is trying to navigate their way into an organization they've heard, they know that can be helpful, but then they are trying to look through the sheet and there's nobody there who can speak their language. And then you add another sheet of, you know, this person is in, you know, has small children and needs a place for their children to be safe. And so you start adding sheets, and one sheet might not be so difficult to navigate because you can probably just pull it off. But, you know, you have 5 or 10 sheets on top of you, and all of a sudden you can't breathe, you can't move, you can't see past it. It just becomes impossible, really, to you know, lift up the sheets and be able to get what you need.
I really appreciate that analogy. That really creates a very compelling visual that helps me, and I think a lot of people, understand how multiple oppressions can play out in the lives of survivors. So thank you. So now I'm interested in seeing kind of if you guys can think of an example of how these social norms actually play out in the life of a survivor. You know, what is an example, just to give folks something concrete to explore?
You know what immediately came to my mind? We were talking about that social norm around rigid gender stereotypes, and I can remember several years ago working in a domestic violence shelter, a little boy, probably 4 or 5, holding up a Barbie doll and saying to Mom, "Mommy, if you looked like this, Daddy wouldn't hurt you and we wouldn't have to be here."
Wow.
And at that very young age, he had already internalized what women are supposed to look like, and if they don't look that way, then they might let down a male partner, and there are consequences and so forth. So it was a very palpable experience to see that so clearly and so young.
Yeah, it's really poignant. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, the one I was thinking of is we're doing a lot of work with our local child welfare agency right now, and it's been just an awesome learning experience for all of us, I think, and really recognizing the limitations in that system to protect victims. So, okay, so let me try to explain this, right? So we have, again, sort of these classic gender roles of, in a straight relationship, male partner is the breadwinner and the decision maker. Female partner is the sort of stay-at-home mom, caretaker, right? She may be doing other things as well, but sort of those roles. And the male partner is alleged to be abusing the female partner, right? There's domestic violence going on. He's the perpetrator. And what these sort of gender roles have done, because they're so stuck in us, is that instead of a child welfare system, and sometimes both happens, but instead of a child welfare system really going after the perpetrator of abuse in that household, what they will often do is hold mom accountable for failure to protect, which is, legislated in the Welfare and Institutions Code about a parent, often the mother, who won't leave an abusive situation. And so that becomes really problematic. It's a big point of discussion for us in our partnership with our child welfare agency, and they are so open and willing to sort of hear us and figure that out. And there's also responsibility for both parties. But where we often see the responsibility for the children lie is in this victim of domestic violence, who is the mother and is supposed to be the nurturer and supposed to do all these things. And I often find myself being that voice, and our advocates are as well, why isn't dad protecting the children, right? He's actually the one perpetrating the violence, but because we have this deep sort of commitment to mothers being the nurturers and the ones responsible for kids, then we sort of let him off the hook in this really interesting way. We don't see charges for failure to protect the actual perpetrator. So it's a really real one right now for us, and trying to figure that out, because then once families are in the child welfare system, there are all these other really challenging things that they have to navigate.
Right. I think a really important one for me has been, throughout the history of my work, I've seen, and I've worked with survivors who are told, well, and I think it's not just the domestic violence field movement that does this, right? But every time, everything you see says, if you are a victim of domestic violence, call 911 for help. And there are so many communities out there where calling 911 is not helpful for lots of reasons, lots and lots of reasons. And I think that's been one of those places where there are so many intersections, so many things happening, not only with that family, but also in that community, where, the expectation from society, right, from everyone around them is, well, just call and ask for help. And if you call and ask for help, all of these things will happen. All of these good things will happen. And that's not always the experience, right? Undocumented immigrants, don't call necessarily 911. Don't call the police for help for lots of reasons. And we've ended up having to do legislation to protect undocumented immigrants from deportation. But we also have other, communities of color who are also not feeling like law enforcement and calling the police isn't a valid option for them. And so there's this inherent contradiction in, what we say, will be helpful and what actually is helpful depending on the type of oppressions that are working in that home, with that family, in that community, and also perceptions of that community as well. So those are some of the stories that I seem to always remember.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing those. And the last question I want to ask is, each of you provided a very compelling example of, kind of that leads us to solutions, basically. But I want you to spell those out for us. So for Kathy's example, when the little boy held up the Barbie doll and asked, said, if you looked like this, you wouldn't have gone through this. What needs to be different to prevent that from happening? How do social norms need to change? And how can organizations, encourage this? So any organization, any institution.
I think we call them the toy industry. I mean, truly, it shouldn't just be advocacy organizations that are working on it. So to change social norms, if we're going to change what Barbie is all about in this country, then we need to call on toy makers to say we want more diverse and healthy images of women in toys, women and girls, from Barbies to Bratz dolls to whatever else there is. Toys for girls are and boys are very segregated and perpetuate the notion that, you know, boys like trucks and violence and girls like, you know, makeup and boobs. I don't know. So, I mean, I think that, you know, and there are some toymakers out there that are, you know, encouraging science for girls. There's a Microsoft, I think, commercial right now that talks about
engineers.
Yeah, giving girls the tools they need. You know, give her the tools she needs to change the world. So, I think it starts really young.
What about some of the other examples? Or Kathy, did you have a follow-up?
No, I mean, I think about, like, all coming to this point of critical mass where we decide that we are going to value healthy relationships, period. And a lot of things will spin from that in the sense of just messaging everywhere we go, whether it's toys, whether it's, I was on the train today and overheard some, you know, person talking on the phone to their partner, and it sounded fairly controlling and coercive, and the sense of it's not just about getting to that young boy with the Barbie doll, but we need to have universal messages that we're just swimming in everywhere we turn, whether it's in our faith communities, whether it's our elected government officials, whether it's our schools, our athletics, and what have you. But it's not just, to me, the messages, I think, need to be positive, solution-oriented, and really say that we value healthy relationships, we value equity, we value respect, and that I just keep thinking of the sense that we're swimming in those messages all over the place. That's what I am really kind of jazzed about, and I think that's when we're going to start to see others, you know, when that becomes the norm, there's more social pressure to conform to that positive norm. And there are opportunities for us to you know, break that social norm of relationships are just private, and to say to a friend, you know, hey, that's not cool, what's happening, or I know that you may have seen or heard that, but really this is what we want to strive to in our community. So that's where I go.
Yeah, and I love that because we've certainly in the last several years really been talking about while our movement has really focused on what's wrong in relationships, we haven't necessarily done a great job of what's right in relationships and how those messages are really shared in a clear way. So we've been doing a lot of work with high school students especially to say, okay, you probably now know what's unhealthy and what's abusive in a relationship. Here's what that looks like. But here's also what healthy relationships and loving relationships look like. And where are those models and how do we find them? Because the messages they're getting now from mass media are not necessarily the super, unless you watch maybe the Hallmark Channel or something, you know, really healthy models. So that's been really important to us, is really articulating clearly, this is the behavior that's really healthy. This is what you can do to show respect to your partner. And this is what you can do to ask for that in your relationship as well. And getting clear for people on that.
And they need to hear that reinforced everywhere.
And how can those messages at the individual level also be elevated to a systems level, right? How can we also have those types of relationship with child welfare system? How can we also have those healthy relationships with law enforcement? How can we also have healthy relationships with, you know, mainstream domestic violence organizations? How can we have healthy relationships? And so it becomes a social norm that goes from the individuals that you all are working with all the way up to our legislators, and you know, and it just becomes duplicated, and it just becomes a norm.
Right. So we were watching in class the other day. I teach at our local university, and we were watching a documentary about music videos and how powerful those were for my generation, certainly. And it's changing a little bit now, but and we certainly see, you know, people like Lady Gaga, I mean, really taking on the issue of sexual assault and unhealthy relationships, and how powerful it would be if the messages that we saw in our celebrity world were really about healthy relationships, and what does, you know, peaceful, respectful, you know, relationship really look like. So we had that conversation, which was really fun, about like, okay, if you really want that message to go big, who do we need to get involved? And where we are now is sometimes looking at those voices as well.
And I think there's more and more of those voices.
I agree.
Right?
Yeah.
I think there's more and more of those voices. There's
Yeah.
more and more of those models.
Yeah.
There are more and more, there's just more for us to point to, whereas even in my own experience 10 years ago, I might not have had a whole lot to be able to point to in popular media
Right.
or popular culture, but I think there's a lot more that we can at
Yeah,
this point.
it's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
And more that becomes less of the exception than the rule.
Right.
Um,
Awesome. Well, this ends our Periscope chat. I just want to thank each of you for this amazing, rich discussion. And I want to let all of our viewers know that this video has been recorded. So we're going to be posting this on our YouTube channel, and we encourage you to share it with your friends, your family, your colleagues, and definitely stay tuned also for our next Periscope chat, which will be next week. We'll have a whole series really happening each week for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So thanks again, and take care.